look, there is a temptation to have our message be entirely about Donald Trump because we're so disturbed by what his return would mean.
Right.
And maybe a little more also about JD Vance because of how odd he's turned out to be.
I got to tell you, boy, did that dude drop a turd on launch. Like, I've never seen anything like that, where they were like, one day they were like, the heir to the MAGA fortune and the Prince JD shall march. And he comes out and he's like, I hate cat ladies, you know.
No, it's rough. And you know, just like systematically insulted so many people. And, and it's not just the kind of things he said, but the policy ideas behind them. Like, he has this idea that you should get extra votes if you have kids.
Extra votes?
Yeah, he suggested that you should have extra votes if you're a parent.
Really?
Now, I think there's lots of things.
You don't even get that in your own house. I'm a parent. You don't get anything.
It's true. I'm starting to find that. I mean, ours are not yet 3, but and it's rooted in this strange idea that it's not just. He doesn't just say that being a parent gives you, an important role as a citizen, which I agree with, that it gives you unique perspective on the future. It's that not being a parent makes you less. Like
I think that's absolutely how they feel.
He said, people who don't have children, this is a quote, have no physical commitment to the future of this country.
Wow.
And I just think about how, like, no physical commitment to the future. Like, when I was deployed to Afghanistan, I didn't have kids back then.
Right.
But I will tell you, especially when there was a rocket attack going on, my commitment to this country felt pretty physical.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's bonus episode. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones, the little-known story of Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, the film the Kremlin does not want you to see, so be sure to watch it. All right, so full disclosure, I was out late last night. I probably got 5 hours of sleep. Where was I? I was at a political salon with a bunch of activists helping each other through this moment that we're in and really making our plan on how we are going to ensure that Kamala Harris and the rest of us, wherever you're listening to this, defeat the misogyny and racism inevitably coming our way, and the October surprise inevitably coming our way. And not only that, once we get through phase 1, we're going to then focus on phase 2, which is about Trump-proofing and Putin-proofing our democracy, starting with passing the National Vote Compact, which would basically be a workaround so that the popular vote, not the Electoral College, determines who is president of the United States, the most powerful job in the world. And if you want background on the National Vote Compact, I will link to an interview I did with one of the organizers of that growing movement. They already have 209 electoral votes across states that have passed legislation to ensure that the winner of that those states will vote, put their electors towards the popular vote, and there's a handful of states more needed. We're very close there. This is happening. This can absolutely happen. There's legislation that's moving in Michigan, Arizona, North Carolina. Pennsylvania needs to wake the fuck up because we need Pennsylvania to get on board with this. So if you want background on this, just go to the show notes of this episode and you can read more about that. And the other thing I really stressed in our meeting last night was that we need to focus on the census 2030 because it's the census that helps determine it's the census that determines representation and gerrymandering and districting, right? Because the size of the population determines how much representation you get in Washington. And that in turn determines the district maps. And that's what the whole process of that is what the Republicans wage illegal warfare on to gerrymander. Remember, the United Nations issued a report that the United States of America has a gerrymandering crisis. If you want to know where MAGA came from, it's because Republicans gerrymandered the fuck out of these House district and U.S. House of Representative districts, as well as state level districts. And that extreme gerrymandering crisis fuels the hyper MAGA extremism we have in America. Why? Because as a Republican, it's deliberately engineered by the oligarch far right that funds all this gerrymandering that you cannot win a Republican primary in many districts across America, including on the state level and the congressional level, both, okay? You cannot win a Republican primary without being weird as fuck. So everyone's now using the word weird. Where do you think weird comes from? It's the gerrymandering. And so the weirder you are, that's how you're going to win your primary, because it's designed that way. And that's why the general elections in these extremely gerrymandered races cut out any chance for, in some cases, especially in states like Texas, cut out the chance for Democrats to compete, because those districts are designed intentionally to consolidate as much Republican votes in that district and water out the Democratic vote. So how do we fix the gerrymandering crisis that's fueling the dictatorship threat we're all under, the census in 2030? So we're not going away. Electing Kamala is stage one. And then these other two things, making the Electoral College obsolete through the National Voter Pact, and then making gerrymandering obsolete through the census in 2030, those are the next stages. And we're going to do this. We're going to get through it together. We have the grassroots, and we have to talk about this and put it out there and make it sexy. All right, that's me. That's my job, to make this sexy. And I'm feeling super sexy right now, let me tell you. All right, so we've got some questions from our listeners, and then we're going to play a continuation of my conversation this week with the great Terrell Starr of the Black Diplomats podcast and Substack. Terrell just made it to Ukraine. God bless him. I love him so. And we hope and pray that he comes home safely. If you want to hang out with me and Terrell and watch a live taping of Gaslit Nation, please join us on Monday, September 16th in New York City at the beautiful Ukrainian Institute of America, where we are going to have a discussion about my new book, the graphic novel adaptation of my film, Mr. Jones. The book is called In the Shadow of Stalin, The Making of Mr. Jones. And that wonderful live taping is going to be followed by a wine reception. Gaslit Nation listeners who support the show on Patreon get in free. You guys get in free because we could not have this show without you. You make it possible. So you're the guest list, guys. So let me know if you want to go, if you're on Patreon, and I will add you to the guest list, and we'll all hang out and have a fun time on September 16th. And then we're going to win on November 5th, 2024. So make sure you are registered and that your family, friends are registered to vote, because they're working hard. They are working hard to scrub us off of these voting rolls. All right, so let's get down to some questions. Work for Better, Prep for Trouble, that is the Gaslit Nation listener, Work for Better, Prep for Trouble, writes, given the you won't have to vote anymore giveaway, Rachel Maddow noted that 70-some election deniers are in office throughout the states. Maddow did not, however, note which deniers were in what positions of authority. Is there any compilation of such actors? Maddow didn't prognosticate as to how such might play out, but I can see the lead-up propaganda, the confusion such agents could cause, and a resulting coup. Thoughts? A Rolling Stone report that was done along with a newsletter called American Doom, and in it they discovered that there's around 70 proud MAGA big lie election deniers spread out across 16 counties in swing states. And reading the article, which I'll link to in the show notes, you can see the several references to these individuals by name and what positions they hold. So just by the article, we can read that. We have that information. And what they are doing is that they have a history of refusing to certify elections. This is new. Voter suppression by the Republicans has always existed. It's always been a crisis. That's the way they win in many cases across the country. And what's new, though, is what Trump innovated, which is this refusal to certify elections. And the number one state with the highest number of refusals by Republicans in positions of power in these election offices, refusing to certify elections, is Georgia. And I want to make clear to everyone, they are throwing everything they can at the state of Georgia. They're trying to steal Georgia out in front of everyone's eyes. So remember the chaos in Florida. Do you remember that Florida in 2000 when it was Gore v. Bush? Well, that was a Supreme Court case, but Gore versus Bush, and then that led to the Supreme Court case of Gore v. Bush. But do you remember in the 2000 election, there was that Secretary of State in Florida who was so pro-Trump, and I think her name was Kathleen Harris, and she promised, she's so pro-Bush, and she promised Bush that she would deliver the state of Florida, and she started scrubbing voters off the rolls. And that election came down to Florida by a handful of votes, and the Supreme Court stopped the recount in Florida. So we don't know who won Florida legally. We don't know who won Florida because of the Supreme Court. And George W. Bush became president, and he unleashed the four horsemen of the apocalypse by invading Afghanistan and Iraq, which gave birth to ISIS and all the instability and so on. And then in 2004, there was a lot of nefarious going-ons around voting machines in Ohio in 2004, again for George W. Bush. And long lines and people being turned away from polling stations and just a lot of shadiness. And so just to recap, in 2000, it was Florida. In 2004, it was Ohio. In 2024, it's Georgia. It's Georgia. Look at what they are doing to Georgia. This week's episode went in on it. I'll recap that again because this is a crime that is being carried out in the open. And Merrick Garland, if we had a real attorney general, Merrick Garland would hold a press conference right now and call this out and call for investigations and put a target on the heads of the people doing this. But we don't have a real attorney general. He's selective in his justice, and he's the product. He's a product of institutional rot. And not only that, he's just the worst person for this job. He would have been fine on the Supreme Court because he would have been a moderate on the Supreme Court. But we don't have time for a moderate right now. We don't have time for somebody who is go along to get along. He came from prior to serving as Attorney General. He came from a court in Washington D.C. that's famous for its consensus building and not rocking the boat. And one could say, yeah, I mean, Merrick Garland was put in a position of power so as not to rock the boat. That's exactly why he got the job. So to not hold anyone accountable so they can all stay in power and enrich themselves and nobody gets shaken, right? Because once you start pulling that thread, who knows where it's going to lead. So Merrick Garland is just the latest placeholder, right? For the big inner club that we're not members of. But so he's the worst person for the job. But if we had a real attorney general that cared about civil rights, they'd be holding a press conference yesterday and calling all of this out by name and calling for announcing investigations, ideally announcing arrests, and so on. So just to be very clear, here's the crime that's currently being carried out in Georgia. So we all are grounded on what's happening before our eyes. So Sidney Powell, back in early 2021, January, hired a group of software experts to go into Coffee County, Georgia. They're allowed in through the front door by Republican officials working for the state of Georgia, and they copied a lot of sensitive voting data on voting machines. And they took whatever they absolutely could grab, thanks to these Republican officials on the inside. And that sensitive voting data and voting machine software data was spread around among MAGA diehards and could have ended up in the hands already of foreign adversaries like Russia. And these voting machines are still being used across the state of Georgia. And this same county just experienced a cyber attack, Coffee County, Georgia. And Republican officials have not been forthcoming there about what was breached, what impact it's going to have on this election. And this is crisis level. There's grassroots groups of activists who are suing the hell out of officials in Georgia, demanding accountability, demanding transparency, demanding security measures be taken, and they're just getting stonewalled. So they are, and what's crazy is that Brad Raffensperger, who was, the Georgia Secretary of State, who is in the crosshairs of Trump's big lie movement. They're harassing the hell out of him for trying to squeeze him to steal Georgia for Trump in 2020, and he held his ground, and he became a hero of many Americans for a while, including cable news, for standing up to Trump. And yet Brad Raffensperger is allowing all this to go on. He's allowing all this to go on. So I think it's Brad Raffensperger has to decide, can't he just bite his lip, just suck it up and just let a black woman be president? Come on. It's like, I know it's like, that's seriously what's on the minds of some of these white men in positions of power. It's like, ooh, Trump is obnoxious, but do I really want this uppity black woman? Who does she think she is being president? You think you're better than me, Kamala Harris? Like, that's what it's about, That's the dynamic we're dealing with. Otherwise, Brad Raffensperger and the rest, and Brian Kemp would be holding a press conference about this right now. All right. And so the big danger is that they're going to try to steal Georgia. Their goal is to steal enough votes in the Electoral College so that Trump is the outright winner. Their fallback plan, their plan B, is to get the election so close that it's a tie by stealing the vote, by suppressing the vote, that the election then goes to the House of Representatives, where MAGA Mike Johnson, who deliberately held up Ukraine aid for 6 critical months, allowing Russia to gain the advantage on the battlefield. That's all deliberately done. So then MAGA Mike Johnson would decide who gets to be president, and the Senate would decide on VP. So let's say that happens and we get Trump, Harris, because obviously the Democratic-controlled Senate would choose Kamala Harris as a VP, and then the MAGA-controlled House would choose Trump as president. So imagine we have a Trump-Harris White House. What happens then? Then the Heritage Foundation comes rolling through with Project 2025, and they mass purge the government, and Harris would get booted, because that's what dictators do. And so it wouldn't matter that we had a Senate that appointed Harris as vice president, because Project 2025 would cancel that out. That's the plan. All right. So, and then on top of that, as I mentioned, you have a new AI software called Eagle AI, funded by a Christian nationalist group called Zeklik. I mentioned this on this week's most recent episode. Eagle AI allows anyone to challenge someone's voter registration. And where is it currently most effective in terms of how voter registration is set up? Georgia. MAGA activists have already used Eagle AI to challenge the voter registration of 10,000 voters, overwhelming election officials in that state. What is the point of Eagle AI? To scrub people off the polls so that when you show up to vote, your name's not there, even though it's always been there. And then you have to file a provisional ballot to vote. And provisional ballots are easy to challenge because maybe you didn't enter something correctly. And they're basically creating chaos at the polls to overwhelm these election offices so that lines are longer and that people are turned away at the polls because it's just the line is just so long, they can't do it. And I want you to keep in mind that Georgia passed laws that make it illegal now for you to bring food and water to people waiting in line to vote. That's new. So that's authoritarian. That's a law that Russia would pass. So when people talk about Project 2025, that it's coming, it's always been here. Project 2025 is already here. These Republican hostage states are already bubbling cauldrons of authoritarianism. And the reason why they are aligned with Russia, these MAGA Republicans, is because they want to usher in that playbook for themselves. They want to live above laws, they want to live above accountability, and they want to live by the jungle laws of the meanest dog in the fight wins. But they don't understand that that's such a slippery slope and that there'll always be a meaner dog than you. Just ask any of the powerful Russian oligarchs that dared to stand up to Putin ever, okay? And how that went. They all got liquidated. So there you have it. All right, and so what do we do about all this? I mean, we should have a DOJ, as I said, doing something about this. The most important thing, as I mentioned this week's episode, is check your registration. Have your friends and family check your registration. Check it regularly. Number 2 is be vocal about this. Share this information on social media and demand, call for people to check their own registration. And if you see anything funny happening in your county where you live, report it. Report it to your local state reps. Report it to your Secretary of State. Leave a paper trail that you reported it. Leave a copy of the letter, the email, whatever. Just make sure that you let them know that we're watching. And that puts a lot of pressure on them. And if you're concerned about this, if you live in a swing state like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, contact your local state rep and ask, like, what is your plan to ensure the integrity of the vote this election? That's important. Let them know we're watching and put pressure on them and raise your voice. They're openly trying to steal this election. And on top of that, there's new reporting, which I'll link to in the show notes, that Elon Musk is backing a Cambridge Analytica type voter scrubbing tool that tricks people into giving them personal information, thinking that they're going to get help to register to vote. And all it does is collect information, and that information could be used to then scrub them from the polls. Yeah, they're throwing everything at this, and we need to just be vigilant and stop them. It's going to be rocky times. All right, but that's why we got to vote. We got to be vigilant. All right. Jeremy writes, what is up with JD Vance's obsession with women not having biological children? And so this is out of the Nazi playbook. This is really what the Nazis were pushing for, was women were in the kitchen birthing babies. And that was the glory of German nationalism. So it's a nationalistic fever dream of having all of these traditional families. And so JD Vance, yes, like he was anti-Trump at times, but before he was anti-Trump, he was anti-wokeness. I listened to an interview on MSNBC by his former college roommate who said that JD Vance just had such a huge chip on his shoulder when it came to diversity, when it came to the quote liberal agenda. And yes, he had, it's been reported that he had a trans friend for a while that he then abandoned when his political career was taking off. But he always had this sort of cynical, like, chip on his shoulder, like, I'll show you. And that grievance is shared by all these guys, from Elon Musk to Trump. Like, I'll show you, I'll Elon Musk, I'll buy up Twitter and I'll be the new Twitter. And it's now called X. It's really that simple, that they just want to put us in our place. And that whole Republican control of bodies, that's authoritarianism 101, because when you control the body, you control the soul. What you're doing is you're forcing people to police themselves. They then are so dependent on the rules and restrictions of the regime, they start questioning what they're allowed to do. You're in their head, and they have total domination over you. This is how dictatorships operate. And what JD Vance is pushing in calling out people without children and saying we have to be aggressive and go all out to war to force people to have kids, that's core to Project 2025, by the way. And Project 2025 has always been with us in the decades of the Reagan Revolution, in the rise of the Reagan Revolution and the decades since. Reagan came to power when Christian nationalists became more organized and united their vote to bring him to power. And then they started acting through the Reagan administration and pushing for their laws, pushing for their rollback of regulation, pushing for the things they wanted. Why? Because this rising Christian nationalism in the 70s and leading up into the 80s was funded by big oil, right? Because this was all these oil producing southern states with big old evangelical churches uniting together to build political power. And the corporate class at the same time was also organizing. And all of this was happening. The fire was lit under them as a backlash to civil rights. And Reagan's success in defeating Carter was a product of their efforts in the decade or so prior. And as they were rising up, they were looking for a strong man that could carry out Project 2025, which has always been there. And we see it now in states like Ohio, Missouri, Florida, right? It's always been there. And core to Project 2025 is getting women back in the kitchen, knowing their place, undoing the progress of women's liberation, oppressing LGBTQ plus people, scapegoating them, and forcing all of us to live under their version of white Christian traditional values, and that the real Americans were in the rural America, and these heathen, godless, woke urbanites are traitors. They're stupid. They need to be brought to heel. That's Nazism. That's exactly what Hitler ran on. in the 1933 election was the real Germans, the country folk. And when he became dictator, they were promoting real German women have a lot of babies, and real German men, including elite Nazi officers, take several wives. They take several wives to have as many, as many German babies as possible. So yeah, when you hear JD Vance attack childless people, that's straight out of the Nazi playbook, and it's core to Project 2025. Flounderlicious WA writes, Andrea, I wanted to ask a follow-up to this episode, Kremlin Convention. I see a fresh surge by Jill Stein to push reject both parties and genocide, vote green. Could you please give us all the 60-second refresher on Jill Stein, her shady right-wing funding, and how the right tries to split the left? Absolutely. So Jill Stein is a multimillionaire herself, and her ventures include being a longtime advocate for Putin's Russia. She famously had dinner at an anniversary party for Russia Today, RT, Russian state propaganda, sitting at the same table as Vladimir Putin and Michael Flynn in Moscow in 2015. And there she met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's a genocidal maniac who loves JD Vance and full-heartedly endorsed him. She's been outspoken in parroting Russian disinformation and talking points throughout all of these elections. The Internet Research Agency, which is an infamous Russian bot farm that helped bring Trump to power in 2016 and also was active with the Brexit vote, they were endorsing Jill Stein's candidacy aggressively in 2016 to try to split the vote. And she's been staunchly critical of Biden and playing this whole game of both sides are the same, both sides are corrupt, it doesn't make a difference, and really trying to demoralize people and suppress the vote. And she's somebody who is really gunning for us this election. Like, she's been supported by Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon, Megyn Kelly are all like trying to normalize her as a legitimate candidate and not just a tool of the far right in America as well as Russia that are aligned in trying to dismantle our democracy from within. What is her motive for doing this? Money, power, and it's really as simple as that. At this political salon I went to last night, one of my dear friends there used to work for somebody, I shouldn't probably say, but somebody very infamous who drives us all nuts. And she knew this person way back when and said that they were normal once upon a time. And it wasn't until they got into money problems that suddenly they became a spewing Kremlin disinformation agent with a lot of money and a lot of Republican Party backing. So if you think that Jill Stein has some sort of altruistic Green Party save the environment motive, no, it's really as simple as money. It really does come down to that. And if you want to know sort of a psychological profile of that, watch my film Mr. Jones, because that's what Walter Duranty, the New York Times Moscow bureau, did as well. He covered up a famine, Stalin's genocide famine, in the pages of the New York Times, writing literally there is no famine at a time at the height of the famine. And he did it for money. He did it for power. He did it for fame. That is catnip for people that lack the empathy gene, that lack morals. And many of them exist among us, and they work together because that's how they enrich themselves. All right, Deborah writes, for Gaslit Nation's next Q&A, can you please discuss the alleged agreement that NATO was not going to expand eastward in 1990? Yeah, so to be clear, NATO exists for the simple fact that Russia, the Kremlin, got World War II started by aligning with Hitler. They had the Molotov-Ribbentrop, they had the Nazi-Soviet Pact, where they agreed secretly to carve up Europe together, and they started this party by invading Poland. First the Nazis, and then 2 weeks later the Soviets, and then they held joint Nazi-Soviet military parades in Poland. And by invading Poland, that kicked off World War II. And they were together, the Soviets and the Nazis jointly invaded nearly half of Europe. And it wasn't until madman Hitler turned on Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union that Stalin had to join our side, the Allies, and we used that monster to get rid of the other monster. But the original monster, Russian imperialism, remained. And that is what drove NATO's expansion. And some of the original NATO members, like Denmark, were advocating for these Central and Eastern European countries to quickly join NATO for their own protection. Russian imperialist genocide impacted several nations that were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, and that is what drove NATO expansion. That is what drove NATO expansion, was trying to escape Russian genocidal imperialism, which is brutal, as we're seeing carried out in Ukraine today. And so the West was, as we got into recent presidents, including George Bush Sr., the former CIA director, he was very cautious about NATO expansion and wanted to normalize relations with Russia, as was Bill Clinton. And they were both trying to tell Ukraine, like, no NATO ambitions, you're just going to be a buffer state. There's even a famous speech that George Bush Sr. gave in Kiev called the Chicken Kiev speech, where he warned Ukrainians against having, their own sort of sovereign national security and national identity in the world, and to stick with Russia. And Ukrainians never forgot this speech, and it felt like a very big betrayal to them. So I want to make clear to everyone that the West, especially recent presidents, have very much pumped the brakes on any sort of NATO expansion to Ukraine. And they've done this all to try to placate Russia, thinking that it would work. And even on the eve of the 2022 total war invasion by Russia into Ukraine, I know from very trusted sources that the White House, Biden's White House, had, asked Zelensky, could you please reassure Russia that you will not be joining NATO? And they did. Ukraine did send out a very clear message, and so did the U.S., to the Kremlin, that Ukraine will not join NATO. They promised that. And it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. Russia moved forward with its attempt at a scorched earth invasion of Ukraine, which they convinced themselves would only take 3 days. Why would Russia do that? Because it was never about NATO. It was all about a smash and grab, stealing Ukraine, stealing its resources. And the Russian oligarchs would divvy up Ukraine. They'd take over all the big industry, the mines, all, the gas fields, all of it. And it's just modern day piracy. Russia's doing that right now across Africa. And children, women are paying the price. There's some brutal rapes and torture and just horrible atrocities being carried out by Russian soldiers. And that is what drove NATO expansion. Countries begging to get into NATO for their own protection. All right, everyone. So I hope you enjoy this conversation between me and Terrell Starr. If you want to listen to the full episode, make sure that you are subscribed to the show at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. And make sure you're signed up at the Truth Teller level or higher. And thank you to all of the listeners subscribed at the Democracy Defender level and higher for your questions. It is your questions that shape the show, that inspire me. And I always love, love, love hearing from you. Thank you to everyone who makes Gaslit Nation possible. We could not make this show without you.